Welcome back to another episode of Chalk Talk. Today, I am joined by Coach Bres. We are super excited to kick off another episode of our EDU style podcast. As we do navigate this conversation and any others, we always encourage you to check out previous podcasts as these really do build off of each other. So however you get them via YouTube, however you listen to your podcast, go check out previous episodes as we're continuing to add to a great library for coaches, teachers, and students to really learn the knowledge and language of fitness and fitness education. So we'll go ahead and get this one started. This is Chalk Talk presented by Platform. Let's go. So as I mentioned, we're kicking off another episode with Coach Bres today. Coach Bres and I are going via Zoom today, so it's a little bit different for us, but the same EDU, great stuff that we've been zipping forward. So we are talking about mobility today, and hopefully I get that word right because we're going to be saying it a lot. It's something that we hear and talk about all the time. It's kind of one of those magic buzzwords of fitness on talking about mobility. So I think I know it, Coach Bres. I think we use it a lot. But I think what's going to be really important is we define it so that we understand what we are talking about and what we aren't talking about, because I think mobility sometimes gets tossed around in the wrong context. So let's talk about mobility in general, and then we'll kind of break it down like we always do.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good place to start because it is one of those things now that is super popular, very buzzwordy. And then I think we can all basically know it when we see it, or we have certain connotations for what mobility means. But when it comes to defining it in the most literal sense, a lot of us have struggled. And I would, admit that it's even something that, when I sat down to kind of, go through materials, relevant to this in terms of researching and doing stuff for, programs related to mobility, is you kind of have to take a step back and look at it a bit more scientifically. And I don't mean, diving into data and studies, but thinking about it in a more, definitive standpoint, like what are the components? How do you define it? How do you train it? Go through it in a very sequential order. And that's the only way that you can make mobility make the most sense and become part of what you do, whether it be personal fitness or performance. So I think it is a good place to start. We all know it, like, right? We have movement gurus on Twitter. We've got things like ROMWOD. We've got foam rolling that's before, during, and after workouts that you see no matter what gym you walk into. There's all these like movement hacks and tips that you'll see all over the place. And it kind of all falls under the umbrella that we all think of as mobility. Generally something that is incorporated into a warm up or into a cool down or in a, recovery session, which is good because it's, this falls on the heels of our conversation, last time, which was around recovery in general. So a lot of the same kind of topics apply here today. But what is it really before we talk about the application thereof? I think we should start out with the solid definition and work to build off of that, and understand, though, that when we give this definition, this is something that is not pulled from the encyclopedia of fitness that is widely accepted. It's where we approach the concept of mobility and where I think most people would. But I just want to make that caveat that it's not necessarily something that is, stamp of approval by every, fitness professional or institution across the country. But for us, mobility would best be defined as the ability to voluntarily move a limb or a joint through a functional and the entire functional range of motion with complete control.
So and I'm going to pause you there. I'm going to pause you there because you said a bunch of different things, but I think it's good to restate it because it's, in my opinion, a great definition because it kind of will help us as we get into some of the things we sometimes get confused with what mobility is because of some of those different parts. So voluntarily move a limb or joint through its entire functional range of motion. And the biggest part to me, as you just mentioned, is entire functional range of motion with complete control. And that complete control part, I think, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but it kind of gets into that next part that we kind of talked about touching on is flexibility sometimes getting crossed over with mobility. Because when I think flexibility, it's, oh, so-and-so is super flexible, so they can drop down in the bottom of a squat or anything else like that. But sometimes flexibility and mobility get kind of lumped together, but might not always be the same. And to me, it's almost with that complete control part that we're talking about being kind of the delineation. So that's a great definition. I think I'm going to say it one more time so we're all kind of on the guiding principle. The ability to voluntarily move a limb or joint through its entire functional range of motion with complete control. So with that, you didn't use the word flexibility in that definition. So what is the difference between the two? Is there a helpful way to look at mobility versus flexibility so we can kind of break those two apart as we sometimes often kind of lump them together?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. It's something that we should just kind of dive into briefly, because they are related, right? And I think you said something where often we kind of see somebody do something limber, and we say either, oh, they're very mobile or they're very flexible, and we often use those terms synonymously. When in reality, at least for the purposes of understanding like what you're doing, why you're doing certain things, it's worth separating them, defining them each individually, and understanding how they kind of interact. So, as I said, they're often considered synonyms, but more specifically, flexibility is just the ability of a muscle to stretch beyond its resting state without pain, right? So, when you do a toe toucher or any other one of those static stretches, you feel discomfort in the muscle because it's stretching beyond its comfort zone. It's being passively stretched. You're not moving a limb necessarily. It's just moving a specific muscle. And in more specific states, they've actually showed that you don't really lengthen muscles. You actually just develop a neurological tolerance to the stretch, so you don't feel pain, because your body essentially, it can move the muscle through that full stretch, but it doesn't necessarily know that it wants to, so it will freak out until you've trained it to understand that it can stretch that far. So that's where the pain comes from. And, you're not doing damage necessarily. Your brain is saying, hey, well, stop. We don't want to stretch that far, but you can train it to stretch farther and farther without pain. And thus, if you can stretch a muscle through, or a lot of muscles through, a larger range of motion, then you are going to be able to move through larger ranges of motion in many different movement patterns, right? So, that is obviously, go ahead.
Yeah, you paused, and I thought I had a good kind of question. I think maybe would help kind of hammer this home is, where does static stretching fall in? Because I think that's one where we will talk. Like you could look at three kids and you say bend over and touch your toes, and one can, one can't, and the others maybe somewhere in between, and that's a stretch, for example. Is that something that would be considered in the mobility category, the flexibility category, or is it kind of like that blur of like it's a little bit of both depending on how they're performing it?
Yeah, So the answer to that is basically what you just stated last. And if you'll allow me, the bend over and touch your toes is actually probably the thing people think of most in terms of, flexibility training or static stretching. But in reality, that's as much a mobility item because of the way your pelvis has to move and everything else. But if you allow me, let's think a static stretch instead of something I think a lot of us have done, where you lay on your back and either with a band or somebody else, you have that leg lifted.
Yep.
All right. Basically, you have assistance to lift that leg through as much of a range of motion as you can, and you eventually get a stretch through your hamstrings. That is flexibility. Whereas if you don't do it with assistance, if you just lay on your back and raise your leg as far as physically possible, that's more an expression of mobility because it's a voluntary controlled movement that you are driving. And you'll notice that you probably have less of a range of motion when you're doing it without assistance, right? Because that's your mobility. Flexibility, though, when you teach the muscle to stretch beyond its comfort zone, can improve or increase your total range of motion in something more mobility focused, if you will.
Sure. So almost the idea or the expression, I think back to the part I picked apart a little bit, is like that control piece, is you're trying to control your leg to come up when you're doing it on your own versus you're using maybe some assistance or some other things to get that stretch in to work the flexibility piece. So just one last piece before we move on. Is it fair to say though that flexibility is though a component of mobility? Like, is it live under the umbrella of mobility in some ways, but they're not always the exact same things?
Yeah, it's a big piece of it. It's a component of mobility. So, mobility is a dynamic expression of the ability to combine flexibility with strength and neuromuscular control, right?
Gotcha.
So flexibility is a big piece. It's not important. We've talked a lot about the benefits of stretching, static stretching, and other maybe more dynamic stretches, but it's a big piece. But it's just a piece of a larger puzzle when it comes to true mobility.
Gotcha. Awesome. I think that's a good, helpful breakdown to start the full conversation, because I myself will sometimes use those words kind of intertwined, or like just kind of swap them out without even realizing that there is some differences, and
Sure.
it depends on what we're talking about. So that's helpful. Throughout that kind of first stab of the conversation, you talked a little bit about range of motion, and the ability to move into certain ranges of motion or not. I think that's a good segue, because a lot of times we hear ROM, or we see it spelt out ROM, or sometimes just range of motion for whatever it may be. And I think this goes back to different movements range of motion, and how that applies to the mobility, or maybe so lack thereof. A lot of times we talk about range of motion and immobility, and people's inability to maybe get down into the bottom of a squat, or be able to move in certain ways because of their lack thereof. So talk to us a little bit about kind of range of motion and immobility, and how this kind of works into the conversation of mobility itself.
Yeah, I like that, because really, I like to think that it's easier to visualize and understand mobility in reverse by looking at very obvious examples of immobility. I think we all can very easily see, an example of immobility. For example, if you have an athlete that may or may not be able to get to or below parallel on a squat, right? If assuming that that person has enough basic strength to move through the complete range of motion. Some brand new trainees might not have that yet, but assuming that you do, if you can't move, through that range of motion that we've all identified as desirable or doable, you have a very clear example of immobility. And then you can start thinking about, all right, well, where are the immobility issues that are kind of holding back my mobility? In a squat, there's a lot of different places you got to start looking. It's, is it the ankles? Is it dorsiflexion, the ability to drive the knee, over and past the toe? You could have flexibility issues in the back of the lower leg. You could have structural issues at the ankle, impingements. They do, joint distractions. That's what you do when you put a band over the ankle and walk out away from a rig, and you're trying to separate the ankle joint to create more space and allow for greater range of motion. Maybe it's in the hips. It could be a lot of different things, but it's a very obvious expression of immobility, and thus you can kind of look at that as the flip side of what mobility is: the ability to move through the entire desired range of motion on your own, right? So it's the ability to actually get down and get up out of a squat, rather than just, can I have somebody raise my leg up as far as it goes before I feel kind of encumbered through a stretch.
Yeah, and I think I like the squat example a lot, because a lot of times, especially with younger athletes, they can squat down to the bottom of a squat, but they lose a lot of other stuff, because
Right.
they might have certain mobility in some areas and lack thereof in others, and they kind of skip steps, or their knees are going in different directions, but it allows them to kind of get their butt down to the bottom of the squat. I see it all the time with some of the younger kids that I coach that are freshmen, sophomores, that are can kind of get away with things. But going back to that like true definition of mobility, it's kind of nice to know that like we're asking and tasking a whole range of muscles and joints to work together, not just kind of like sneak in different ways that you can get things done. So I think the squat's a great example, is the way you were talking about it. We're talking about all of those kind of boxes being checked, and then can you perform that kind of range of motion that we were talking about? Not, the only goal on the checklist is can you squat, to depth or whatever it may be, because all of these other things have to happen with it, and it becomes that combination. But we've all seen the kid who is doing all of the things right as well, and just cannot will themselves to get any lower. And then some of those other kind of diagnoses or whatever else you were mentioning is where it kind of then comes into play a little bit more.
Yeah, and the squats, I mean, we could probably spend an entire episode just talking about how to use the squat as a very loose mobility screen. As you said, ankle mobility might not be a problem at all, and they can, drop hip level as far as they want, but either like the upper back thoracic spine collapses because they don't have, upper thoracic mobility or shoulder mobility, or the knees cave because they, don't have mobility about the knee slash hip, aka, either the external rotators of the hip can't turn on, or there's a structural issue. And that's where, mobility, you might use one movement, but it's mobility about any given joint. So you can look at like total body mobility, and that's
Sure.
obviously comprised of a lot of different specific joint mobility pieces. And I think that's the important part, because what I think many people realize without realizing is that there are a lot of different reasons that any given joint will lose its ability to move through the fully intended range of motion and become, compromised or immobile. And there's, literally tons of different reasons. It's going to happen to most people at some point. It's daily life, posture, or just the activity of whatever it is that you do on a daily basis, the rigors of, daily life. It could be, the stress of training, acute injury. There's a lot of things that can happen that change the way your body moves, because you got to remember, we're natural organisms, we're organic. Things change based on what we do. So
Right. And I think it's
the most
helpful to know that it's a fluid thing, that you could be, it's not like, oh, I'm super mobile today, so it's a guarantee for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. It's an active expression of always kind of working towards it throughout our daily lives. Like you mentioned, posture is a great one, or whatever else it may be. Sometimes it could just be you slept on the wrong side of the bed and you got up and are feeling, some sort of immobility because of however that is as well. And I think an important point, and I'm sorry to cut you off and I'll let you keep going, but I think sometimes we try to compensate for some of those things. And I'm sure you're going to get to this, but I think right now it's probably helpful to kind of talk about that a little bit, because like a lot of times, because we're immobile, relax certain ranges of motions and maybe certain muscles or joints, we kind of task, because we're this kind of fluid organism all working to try to get certain tasks done, to compensate. And are there kind of downfalls for that? Or it's just, hey, I'm not super mobile in this area and that's okay. I'm never going to be. I'm just going to always compensate on these other things. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, absolutely. And it's absolutely where I was going to go next, because there's a serious issue with not, call it, treating mobility problems, in that you're always going to kind of trend downwards from there. Because think the most extreme case we can. Let's say you have ACL surgery, reconstructive surgery. We all know that if you're in a brace rehabbing from, a acute injury and subsequent operation, you are going to experience a drastic reduction in mobility about the knee. The knee does not move through its intended range of motion fully, but your life continues. And your body is going to compensate, whether or not you know it. And I think that's the important part. You mentioned, like, we will compensate. Well, you might not compensate. Your body will. You will think that you are doing all of the same
Right.
things that you used to do, but you're going to do them in a different way. So, take the ACL injury example. As you gain the mobility back in that knee, your body is essentially going to be turning off certain muscles and turning on others, either at that exact point or elsewhere in your body, to allow you to move through the ranges of motion that you are asking it to do. And the moment we allow that to continue, you're going to find yourself, not to be, apocalyptic, but in a world of hurt down the road.
Mhm.
Because the more that your body is asked to compensate and use muscles nearby or far away, up and down the kinetic chain, that it's not meant to use during that range of motion, you're going to set yourself up for injury, small or large, down the road elsewhere. And so, not only does immobility, in the kind of the broadest sense, increase the likelihood of injury, it's also very much going to decrease performance in any way, shape, or form, right? Because you're not going to move in the most efficient manner. If you're not moving through the intended range of motion with the intended musculature, it's not as efficient as it could be. So you're at best not going to operate at maximal ability, and at worst, just going to set yourself up for problems down the road.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point in terms of understanding that you're not saying to yourself, like consciously all the time saying, this part of my body is somewhat immobile because of whatever reason. So I'm going to tap into these other parts, but I'm going to be super careful doing it. Sometimes your body just does it. And so in athletics or anything else like that, if you're on the field of competition and all of a sudden you're lacking mobility in some form or fashion and you're getting pushed, shoved, or doing whatever, you're going to compensate without even realizing it. And I think that's where, as you've talked about in previous episodes and different things, you lead to maybe some risks of injury or putting yourself in a compromised position, whatever it may be. I think we could probably spend a lot of time giving all sorts of different examples. And I think as we go through this, whoever's listening, whoever's going to try to, convey this to other people are all aware of different immobilities they might have personally or they see all the time. Just the example of sitting in a chair all day and feeling what that might happen in terms of the immobility that will come from sitting stiff or slouched over or anything else like that. So I think the next kind of segue, if you'll allow it, is almost thinking about fixing it in a way or working to improve it, because it makes sense to the degree of we know ourselves, we know what might be immobile, but it's how do you actually deal with it? Like, how does it actually get better? We said it's not the static thing, I'm mobile or immobile. You can get immobile pretty quickly. How can you fix the mobility itself or work towards that side of the equation?
Yeah, and yeah, we should, and I'll jump into it in just a second. One thing I did want to mention though is I think what we tend to forget, or maybe just don't understand, is there is no such thing as a body that's just completely inactive, right? So you mentioned that sitting at the desk. I think people think like, oh, if I just sit here, then like I'm basically stuck. The issue is like anytime you are in a position, muscles in your body are turned on. So to sit hunched forward, everything up here is actually contracting and everything back there is relaxing.
Yeah, that's a good
And
point.
thus, you're going to have a whole bunch of weak, inactive muscles in the back, and you're going to have a bunch of tight, overactive muscles in the front. And despite thinking that you haven't asked your body to do anything, you are asking your body to do something all day long, which is going to add up to those immobility issues that we see. So it is important. Yes, everybody knows like, oh, maybe my shoulder mobility is not great. Well, to your point of how do you fix that? Well, let's also remember what's causing it, right? So we don't want to just work on, the hacks and the fixes after the fact. Remember that every time you move or every time you're active, you want to think about being in a balanced, proper, efficient position so that you're not setting yourself up like a fix might be fixing your posture over time.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it is important to know
I think,
that, you're not just inactive all day.
yeah. And I think that's helpful, especially because it's that consciousness that I said you're not always conscious of, but it might be beneficial to actually be a little bit more conscious and be deliberate in the way you move or the way you sit or the way you walk or the way that you do your daily activities, and thinking about how it does affect those different types of things. And it might feel silly, especially with the audience we might be trying to convey that to in middle or high school students. But I think what you just said is we are doing something when we're sitting. It's whether we're doing the good thing and drawing your shoulder blades back and sitting up straight, or allowing yourself to do that other part of it is a really great point. I think that helps put it into context.
Yeah, when it comes to actual mobility training, like once I've gotten into the gym, like I know I have an issue, and thus I can't reach overhead because my thoracic spine is super immobile for whatever reason, sitting, injury, or whatever. There are certainly things we can do and should do on a regular basis, and that's why you see all of the foam rolling and the movement drills and hacks, and it is a important part of training. So I think diving into the what, why, and how is probably the important next step for sure.
Awesome. And I think that's helpful to know that we're not only just talking about fixing mobility in the gym, but outside of the gym. And you mentioned that at the beginning, and now we'll kind of get into the gym. And obviously we don't want to be putting Band-Aids on things and just fixing them. And that's a good caveat to just kind of jump into it. But you mentioned foam rolling, you mentioned a few different other things that kind of talk into mobility training itself. I don't know where you want to start, but I think this is a nice way to start thinking about, all right, let's work actively to improve mobility or kind of address it. So if we're immobile, if we're feeling like, I'm struggling in certain things, we're obviously not going to break down every joint, muscle, and place you could be feeling immobile, but maybe some more kind of blanket umbrellas of those kind of different categories that we consider mobility training to be.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, you hear this all the time, like, I'm going to do a little mobility. Okay, well, like, what do we mean? Like doing mobility? What does that? What does that mean? I think mobility training or mobility work is all about any sort of, making an effort to restore the natural range of motion to a joint, or proactively making sure that you don't lose it. Right. So it's an intentional effort to restore or keep the natural range of motion of any given joint. There isn't just some, blanket mobility that you do for your whole body. You're going to have targeted work for, whatever, movement of the day requires movement about a specific joint, or a joint that has had issues and you want to fix. So foam rolling is a very good first example, because it's probably what a lot of people think about other than static stretching, right? With regards to mobility work. And essentially anything foam rolling is, self myofascial release, which is anything, lax ball, or any one of those instruments that is basically self massage. And we've talked about this in a lot of different podcasts, but just worth reiterating. What you're essentially doing is trying to, in a very targeted fashion, restore range of motion about a joint by, one, breaking up, the adhesions that, again, we've kind of come to find to be probably very accurate, not just kind of a, wives' tale myth, because the structures around a joint, the muscle, the connective tissue, it's all supposed to glide, very freely. And if that gets kind of gunked up, you're going to lose mobility about a joint. So, whether it be because you squatted heavy and your hips are a little tight because it's kind of just gotten a little, junked up in and around maybe your glutes or your hamstrings, releasing those adhesions and allowing the muscles and connective tissue to move again is a good kind of, call it more of like the quick fix. If you have something very targeted as a reason, very targeted as a result, and a fix is foam rolling.
And I will just add, and this isn't a super scientific example, but I think it lends credence to why people associate it. At least is like, you think about how many people go, "Ooh, I got a stiff back," and they grab the foam roller and they're just sprawled out over it and trying to roll out their stiff back. Now, whether or not that's actually addressing their back or whatever it else may be, it kind of clicks in a lot of people's minds that, oh, I have a muscle or group of muscles or area that's feeling stiff or immobile, so I'm going to grab the foam roller. And I know that one's an oversimplification and probably not always the actual fix they want to go for, but is an example as to what people kind of know, like, this feels good and it does make it feel like I'm opening up, or it's maybe rushing some blood to that area or whatever it may be.
So, well, so that's a really good example, and I'm glad you said it, because I was going to go next. Is, whether or not you believe in fascial adhesions, it's a little bit of a debate or whatever. Another potentially very real reason that foam rolling can improve your feeling of mobility. Like you said, I roll out, oh man, my back's no longer tight. Well, what is tight? Well, tight is an overactive muscle. So if your back feels tight, that means things are clenching and
Yeah.
squeezing. And foam rolling can operate much like a lot of different things that are used throughout fitness and training and rehab and PT, which is, call it like the umbrella of active release techniques, right? So it's where you press on a point, you try to move through a range of motion, and it effectively turns off the muscle that it is neurologically overactive. And that's why, so, lower back soreness is often because the lower back is being asked to, bear the brunt of some sort of movement more than it should, because something else isn't working appropriately, something else is turned off. And when you take a foam roll or a lax ball or any one of those routines, you're actually working to deactivate overactive muscles. So you actually feel the kind of the release. That lower back is no longer clenched, and it might not last forever, but you can very much see the difference, before and after. And that's why people feel like, oh, rolling is such a good mobility tool, because it is a kind of a quick fix in some facets, because you've created a problem and now you can go turn off that problem. But the issue remains that if you continue to turn on that problem, that's why it's not just about foam rolling, right? We can turn off those overactive muscles, but if we don't find a way to avoid continually turning on those overactive muscles, right? Like this, if we don't find a way to avoid continually over activating, then we're going to continue to have those problems. But active release, that's why RPR, so reflexive performance reset, I think is the big one right now, which is like Cal Dietz and a couple other big time strength coaches. A lot of people get certified in it, which is that basically active release kind of progression. I'd actually love to dive into that myself. Neurokinetic testing is another one, which I've had done, and it's not fake, because you can see it happen in real time. But it's the idea of being able to restore the proper connection between your brain and the muscles. Turn off the things that aren't supposed to be on right now, that feel tight, that feel overactive. Turn on the things that are supposed to be on, so that when you move, you don't compensate that way.
Yeah, it is. That one's interesting. That one's interesting in terms of like trying to like hit a certain muscle, target a certain muscle, like kind of hammer it, and then see if it changes. And you can see them. Like people will say like, do a sit up, then we're going to activate something. Now we're going to try it again. We did that in college as well and gave that a go. And it is a very kind of cool concept to explore. But I think that one is probably a little bit harder to enact in your everyday lives, especially if you're kind of working on your own or whatever it may be.
Yeah, you're gonna have to have somebody work with you, but the principles can be applied in a little bit more of a looser individual sense, where if you have overactive, you can identify the overactive, or somebody can identify for you. You can find ways to release through through lax ball or foam rolling progressions. And then, as we'll talk about later, there are ways to activate neurologically certain muscles. Again, there's debate amongst fitness professionals, but I think there's something there, and I think we all know that because you can feel it. So that's why foam rolling, just to wrap it all up, is definitely a way in which we can, it's been proven to increase range of motion. Like we've again, I shouldn't say proven. It's been shown to probably improve range of motion on a pretty significant degree across enough evidence that you can say that doing it will, at least short term, improve your range of motion about a joint, which is why it can be used to recover from activity or warm up for activity. And it's a good mobility tool for sure.
Absolutely. Great. And obviously we've kind of weaved a lot of them because a lot of times they do overlap. So that's a good kind of foam roll. Static stretching is one that we've talked about a lot in this episode already, but we've also talked about it in previous episodes, but it kind of goes back to that flexibility component. And we talked about it being a part of mobility, right? So it's a piece to the equation. What does that kind of involve in terms of improving it? I think we often see people go to the foam roller and then very next hit some kind of static stretching before they jump into whatever it may be. And we even talked about it in the warm-up episode and different things like that in terms of all the different pieces. Is static stretching kind of that next step, or in terms of fixing things or kind of mixing it in, or how does that kind of involve all of these pieces itself?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't place it in any sort of order in terms of steps, but it is another component to mobility. As we said, flexibility is an important component. So chronic static stretching or flexibility training will help improve mobility in total, just because you're able to move all of your muscles through kind of maybe their greatest range of motion without pain, and thus that's no longer a inhibitor of movement. If you have super tight hamstrings, it's going to limit the range of motion that your legs can move through, either at the hip or the knee or anywhere, through some range of motion. You don't necessarily know which one it's going to inhibit, but it's going to play a factor, because tight muscle is just not going to allow movement somewhere, right? So flexibility training, obviously, over time can help eliminate those issues. And then it's also been shown as a potential kind of deactivator of overactive muscles as well. If you have super tight active hip flexors, a stretch can do kind of similar things to foam rolling. So that's why people talk if you sit at a desk all day, you sit in a chair, essentially what you're doing is, using your hip flexors in a shortened capacity. And so you need to make sure that you kind of turn them off. And, a simple Samson stretch does that. And people say if you sit at a desk for a certain number of hours, you should, get up every 2 hours and stretch your hip flexors for 30 seconds. And that's the reason why you just need to turn everything back off after having turned them on for such a period of time.
Right. Nice. That seems like an easier one to kind of check the box and cover. And then next, you've already talked about it. I don't know if there's anything else you want to get into with activation, but obviously there is some debate here on that one. And we already touched on it a little bit, but not sure if there's anything else you want to add in on that part of it.
No, I would personally say, again, this is just my personal opinion, that activation is as big of a piece of the mobility puzzle as the deactivation, the rolling, the restoring of range of motion. You lose range of motion when your movement patterns are thrown off, and that's often simply because of compensation. If you can't get your knees out on the squat, again, this might not be the reason, it's one of the potentials, is maybe your glutes are not really firing the way they should. Again, this is something that people debate on Twitter and Instagram and everywhere else, but I can say with at least personal anecdotal evidence that it is something very real, in that if you don't have those muscles firing, you're going to compensate, and you can turn those on. Our esteemed head of sales here, Coach Ian Bonner, says he loves activating the core before squats because he feels far more secure and stable, rather than just jumping into heavy weighted work without it. I'm very much the same way. And if I don't work, glute activation specifically, I will have low back soreness the next day or the next 2 days, without a doubt. Like, that's not, I know that after years of basically testing. So activation is kind of the way to, the other side of the coin is, if you want to avoid having to restore range of motion, is making sure that you've activated everything so that the movement pattern you are performing is operating appropriately and you're not compensating for that movement, which could lead to those issues where you have overactive, tight, sticky movements, down the road. So I think activation's a big piece, at least personally. Again, there's debate there, but I'd argue that it's a really big piece. It's why we do things like band pull aparts, right? You are activating the musculature in the upper back thoracic spine that is turned off all day long. And we're making sure that it is both strong and durable and can basically show muscular endurance, but also that it's on before you do something heavy pressing, maybe.
Sure.
So that you don't compensate. If you don't turn that on because you've sat like this all day and then you go bench press or pull, like, you're gonna potentially set yourself up for a problem.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest way to look at it. And you just threw a lot of different examples around, and a few of them are things that I do myself. And I think a lot of people do, is that they feel as if, I could go do a lot of movements at the snap of a finger. It's not that you can't do them. It's just that you're tasking certain groups or certain areas more than others because you haven't turned others on. If that's like kind of the simplest kind of delineation. Is deadlift's a perfect example for me. I could pick something up off the ground, 10 times out of 10, but activating certain muscles through warm up or different things that we've talked about in the past is going to allow me to do it more efficiently, so that I'm not, keeled over the next day with that lower back problem that we've added too much stress. And I think that's helpful. So that almost segues, or I don't know if it does, into the last one a little bit in terms of some more like mobility drills, almost a little bit more of like the practice of it, and moving through different things, not so much the static, but more so kind of that active in a lot of different ways. So how do mobility drills themselves apply into this kind of greater conversation?
Yeah, and I should say, before I even mention, the more specific examples, just doing air squats could be considered a mobility drill, right? Because you are voluntarily and with control moving through complete ranges of motion. So movement, right, could be considered mobility drills of any kind, so long as you are driving the movement, you are thinking about how you are moving, you're trying to move through a complete range of motion. But if you want to get more specific, right, something as simple as leg swings, standing up against a wall and moving the hip through a complete range of motion forward and back, and then side to side, is taking all of the things that we just did, deactivating, activating, stretching, and then putting it all into practice, putting it all into play, and moving the joint through the intended range of motion. And it's just like, you know, squatting for sprint, squatting and doing plyometrics for sprint speed. Well, you actually still have to go run, right? Like you've turned everything on, you've made it more applicable, you've made yourself more able, but now you have to go do it. And that's where mobility drills come in. It could be something like PVC pass-throughs and around the worlds, right? Like it's all well and good to do all the things like I rolled out my lats and I turned on this, that, and the other thing, but I still can't get through a PVC pass through because you actually have to go out and do it. You have to try it.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the original point too, of sometimes just squats or whatever else, performing different movements are in a way acting and working towards mobility. One I always think of is like the front rack position. There's a million different ways you can hammer home a front rack position before you even are holding a PVC pipe or a barbell or, you know, hammering out your lats or doing a lay and pray stretch or all of these different things. But sometimes quite literally doing an actual front squat or push press and forcing yourself into that front rack position is going to be your best medicine sometimes into improving front rack mobility. Now, obviously you don't want to risk injury because you're so immobile that you're all over the place. But sometimes all of a sudden when you start a front squat, let's say you're doing a 5x5, I'll just use the example. I start, you know, with my elbows a little bit low. And by the time I'm kind of feeling good, you can feel that mobility improving and the elbows higher. And I think that's a good point is sometimes, especially in middle and high school, we see immobility and we want to stop everything. And we see a lot of people on Twitter say, oh, that person is doing X, Y, or Z, completely end it. And I think as we've talked about and we see other coaches describe, sometimes it's okay to not be 100% perfect in mobility or anything else like that, so long as we're keeping kids safe and moving and know that we're actively working towards things in some form or fashion.
Well, it's funny you say that because in reality, there are a lot of coaches that would actually state that the best flexibility, mobility improver or practice is heavy weightlifting. Because it's actually going to force your body essentially through the complete range of motion because you have no choice. That weight's gonna push you down into your squat, and it actually can improve your range of motion just because you have put it into practice and you've done so with, call it assistance by resistance, right? And I think that's a very important point to make is we can do mobility training loaded, unloaded. A heavy front squat is, you know, as long as you are, again, like you said, safe, it is a good mobility enhancer. It's, you know, why we like overhead squats unloaded. It's like we like front squats loaded. It's why we like using, for example, one of the big things that people do for like a mobility activation, mobility drill, position work is grab a heavy kettlebell and just sit in the bottom of a squat. Mm-hmm. Right? It's just going to hold you down in that position. It's doing a lot of those things all together. And I think that's probably the best way to kind of wrap everything up is understanding that mobility work is a huge umbrella, right? Yeah. It's just about movement. And you can get very targeted, like, oh, there is an issue with this joint, there's immobility here, and it's because of, you know, this thing that I can hit with foam rolling, it's because of this thing I can hit with activation. Or it can be full body mobility, and I'm just going to work my, you know, my movement pattern of the squat, or I want to get my depth right, or I want to grease the groove before weightlifting, and I'm going to work, you know, a heavy goblet hold in the bottom to just turn everything on and get myself, you know, mobile and ready to go.
Yeah.
It kind of spans that entire spectrum.
Yeah, and I think that is a good way to wrap up. And you know that I love the highlighter question when I say circle mobility for me on a workout or anything else like that. But I think as we've done in this episode, you know, you could circle mobility work when you're sitting in a chair and working to, you know, sit up with good posture, as I'm now trying to do, as we've mentioned it, or whatever else it may be. And I think that's a helpful one in terms of putting into context, whether it's a warm up, a cool down, the actual kind of meat and potatoes of a workout. There's all different points where we're technically, you know, quote, working on, you know, mobility, unquote, in a certain way, form or fashion. So the original kind of wrap up question I was going to ask you, is it worth our time? Is it real? Should I kind of be working this into my daily life? But it sounds to me as if we're doing that, or we should be doing that naturally throughout our entire day. It's just how kind of deliberate we are within and intentional within kind of mobility training itself.
Absolutely. I mean, it exists regardless of whether or not you think that you are a big mobility person or not, right? It's existed forever. Static stretching for flexibility, moving through compound movements and total range of motion has been part of weightlifting forever. It's things that we do on a regular basis. You go into any warm up today or 30 years ago, people were doing mobility. It just might not have been, labeled as such. Mobility as kind of that, fitness buzzword is probably just that smaller subset of, foam rolling and, maybe mobility drills and activation stuff, like the more kind of, I don't know, marketable pieces or the cooler, sexier looking hacks. But mobility training is really just, mobility is efficient, pain-free movement. There's a lot of ways to go about getting there, and it's absolutely a valuable tool. And no one thing is a be-all, end-all. And it's about finding the right place for the right pieces. And you want to talk about it in the more kind of conventional or maybe colloquial sense of mobility. It's worth fixing issues and preventing them. Through proactive work. Do it before and after workouts. Make it a part of recovery where it's appropriate. Maybe you roll and stretch then. Make it a part of warm-ups where it's appropriate. Your activation and your drills, because it serves two purposes. Just make it work for you. And I think, as with everything that we talk about, you got to try things. And I mean this in the, like, you personally and you with those that you might train or work with. You got to try things. Try them for an extended period of time. See what works. See what doesn't. And kind of curate your approach over time. With the information that you get.
Yeah. And I think that's a helpful way to look at it, especially for even myself thinking about as we approach kind of a new coaching year. And for me, about to jump into a season, I'm thinking, all right, I know certain kids are going to come in having been sitting at home, kind of quarantined and not doing anything. And we're getting a chance to come back in. What are some things and ways that we can kind of mix it in and not lose sight of it and just assume it's going to get better without kind of putting a little attention on it, because they are high school kids and they're not naturally going to just, apply it on their own. So I think the takeaway for me, and I think the takeaway for anybody listening, is there's something that we can consider under that, as you mentioned, umbrella that maybe we have tried, maybe we haven't tried, maybe we want to give a shot depending on that group or audience or how it works. So that's, I think, for me, super helpful. Anything else you want to add or put under the umbrella of mobility that we haven't talked to, or is that a pretty good summary, as it were?
No, I think that was pretty good. I can't speak to whether or not I was super cogent on the entire topic, but I thought we covered everything that I was hoping to.
Lovely. I think so too. And, maybe we should spend time away from each other, Coach Bres, because this might be a record for episode length. Since the last few episodes, we didn't hit that hour mark like we have been of recent. So, maybe it just is, the virtual way that helps us. So with that, we'll pause, we'll wrap up. A lot of this information, a lot of what we talk about mobility is often wrapped into a lot of our programs themselves. We talk about it within our programs. We talk about it within different articles, different pieces that Coach Bres has put out on mobility and its subsequent parts. There's a lot of information on this past just this podcast. So if this has sparked your interest or you have other questions, there's a lot within platform, the exercise and resource vault, and everywhere in between. So don't feel as if this is your one-stop shop. I'm sure if there are parts that you're still interested about, there's other places you can go and check it out. So with that, we will wrap up. Thanks again to Coach Bres. And remember, here at Platform, it's always in pursuit of better.